why is this important?
If you get things wrong, the problems can be quite significant.
Hi, and welcome to The Laundry, a podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. I'm your host, Marit Rødevand, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we're asking, how does compliance keep the legal world ethical? Law firms are responsible for some of the largest transactions globally, from big-name mergers and acquisitions to huge real estate deals and to setting up new companies. But no money movement is without risk, and the legal sector often comes close to some of the most high-risk sectors in the world. So, how does AML and compliance help to keep the sector on the straight and narrow? What are the biggest challenges when it comes to money laundering, politically exposed persons, and sanctioned individuals? And why is it so important to get this right? To delve into this topic, I'm joined by Bruno Edenogie, Head of EU Compliance and Data Protection Officer at Orrick, Herrington Sutcliffe. Hi, Bruno.
Hi.
Welcome to The Laundry. What should listeners know about Orrick and your role in there?
Well, Orrick is a US firm, a global firm. We operate primarily in the US, but we also have offices around the world. My role, I'm the head of EU compliance at Orrick, and I'm also the firm's data protection officer. So I hold a few roles, a few responsibilities, very interesting. On the compliance side, I deal primarily with anti-money laundering, looking at financial sanctions, professional ethical requirements as well. And on the data protection side, we look at laws globally affecting the firm wherever we operate. So it's a very dynamic role, very interesting, and you're always learning. And anti-money laundering is one of those key areas affecting the firm that I'm involved in, also as a deputy MLRO as well, at quite a high level, and also assisting our teams with the routine day-to-day checking and just ensuring that our clients are who they ought to be and that the firm remains safe and operates well.
Thanks for that intro. So let's dig into the conversation.
This episode of The Laundry is brought to you in association with HVIDVASK TERRORFINANSIERING Conference in Copenhagen. This is the event for all those working to tackle AML and terror financing in 2023. Bringing together experts across the financial, private, and public sectors is a chance to learn and discuss the hottest topics in the industry right now. The conference is taking place on October 11th and 12th, 2023. Find out more at insightsevent.dk.
So we've covered a lot of AML topics within banking. So this is the first episode we do on the legal sector. So I think it would be super interesting to hear, for those who are not so familiar with like the intersection of AML and legal, how important is compliance and AML practices in this industry?
It's very important. I think a good way to think about it, if you're new to understanding the UK legal sector, is to think about the sources of the actual laws and rules themselves in relation to anti-money laundering. So I guess the first source relates to the lawyer's professional obligations. They hold numerous obligations, but one is to always act with integrity, to uphold the rule of law and the administration of justice, and also to ensure that their services are not misused by their clients. So that provides them with a more general obligation to ensure that, for example, in the case of anti-money laundering, that they are aware, that they do know their clients, they are aware of the red flags that they ought to look out for in order to detect money laundering and terrorist financing. But the second source, which is also important, are the regulatory and legal laws as well. So in the UK, you have the UK anti-money laundering regulations, but there are other guidelines and other laws within the UK that the lawyer does need to ensure that they are aware of and comply with on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of importance, I guess it's important because falling foul of those rules can be quite significant. Firstly, I guess, in terms of the reputation of the legal profession as a whole, but also for the firm itself, reputationally, and also for the individuals involved who may be fined and suffer other sanctions as a result of breaches of the AML regulations. And in recent times, there have been cases of law firms, some large law firms, quite prominent as well, who have fallen foul of the regulations and the applicable laws. And as a result, they've faced adverse or unwanted scrutiny from the regulators and reputational damage as well. So it's very important. I guess also thinking about the legal profession, as you say, it's a slightly different animal to the financial industry and banks in particular. The AML rules don't apply consistently across all legal services.
No, because it's just, where there is actually monetary transactions, that money shifts hands. That's where those laws come into play, right?
Precisely. And I think if you go a bit further back, the Financial Action Task Force, who sets the international standards for anti-money laundering, and which a number of countries have gold-plated and implemented within their own local laws, those were actually developed with the financial industry in mind. And it doesn't necessarily translate as well uniformly across the whole legal industry. So the AML rules only apply where law firms and lawyers are involved in financial transactions, so real estate transactions and conveyancing, or where there's the use of the client account and so forth. But for those firms which aren't, for example, involved in that type of activity, whether it be just purely litigation or advisory work, then the requirements of the regulations, for example, due diligence, etc., don't necessarily apply. But if you're in big law, they offer full services. Each lawyer has an interest in ensuring that their counterparts, those who they work with on a day-to-day basis, are complying with the regulations, because whatever affects them will affect everyone. True. And we all work together.
True, but you mentioned in the beginning here that you guys need to also make sure you comply and do a lot of activities so you are not exploited by clients, because, clients might take advantage, especially of a tier 1 law firm, it's a reputable brand, etc. Do you have any examples where you guys have uncovered that someone is actually trying to exploit us and, we can't accept them as a client or need to kick them out? Has that occurred?
No, not in my experience. I think it can be quite unusual to detect activity where you actually see that the client is trying to misuse your services. Lawyers, because of their ethical obligations, I'd like to think they're quite risk adverse. As soon as they see something, they tend to step away from it. And our regulator, the SRA, for example, has mentioned in the past that they've seen amongst firms that there's a relatively low level of reporting of activity to the authorities. And that may be because of the risks are so high in acting for those types of clients, firms themselves de-risk and they try to avoid certain transactions or certain clients or certain jurisdictions to avoid that type of risk and to ensure that they're able to operate without seeing the type of AML activity. But I guess as a firm, and in my experience over the years that I've been working in law firms, I've had to submit suspicious activity reports, work with our MLRO, and disclose information to the NCA where relevant. And it's been interesting. And you can think of, I think, where the risk has come up the most has been in conveyancing transactions and in particular the source of funds. And that's something that our regulator focuses on. So
it's a particular focus of interest. But I can imagine with a lot of foreign money have gone into the UK in the last years and bought up a lot of property and done a lot of investments. And, a lot of those individuals now might be facing sanctions, etc. So I can imagine source of funds it's a big thing. You also mentioned de-risking, sorry. I spoke to someone the other day who also saw a trend within de-risking that, you're so afraid to take on risks, so you just don't. But then you end up with sort of a two-tier system, so to say. Those who just no, we're not taking on, and you only get good clients. And then there's the other ones who's you know what, let's specialize more towards the high-risk ones. And do you see that trend in the legal market, or?
I haven't seen that trend. There is evidence that many firms are de-risking. So, for example, within the UK legal industry, we have client accounts. Client accounts, they're not common in the US. I think in France they don't have that model.
We do have it in Norway.
You have it in Norway. Yeah. But yeah, client accounts, obviously, they can be useful and are necessary for certain transactions, particularly conveyancing, but it does come with risk. And they've been used quite well during M&A activity as well, where you're receiving funds perhaps from investors or you're paying money out to related parties. And that brings a lot of risk, not just from an administrative perspective, but also you're receiving funds, you're having to undertake due diligence on that, and you're quite unsure as to, where the money has come from. You try your best, but it doesn't rule out risk altogether. So there's a trend amongst US firms and I believe Magic Circle firms where they have actually stepped back from using the client account, and now
they just think it's too high risk.
Too high risk.
That's super interesting because the client accounts also, it's not so transparent, right? It's so in Norway that was a lot of the conversation. But you mentioned also due diligence. Talk to me about how you guys do due diligence on your clients and like the red flags, if there are any, that you guys look for.
Due diligence. So I guess due diligence, as I'm sure many know, comprises understanding who your client is, verifying their identity, also verifying the identity of the beneficial owners, and just having a better understanding of the transaction, the instructions, and just the client's profile itself. But due diligence is also risk-based. So the regulations now and guidance that we have from the Law Society requires you to perform a risk assessment on the client. And it's actually a very useful exercise because with due diligence, it's quite an onerous task. But if you do carry out the risk assessments, then you can tailor your efforts where needed. So for high-risk clients, you'll obviously undertake more due diligence. If they're low risk, for example, they're regulated by the FCA, then you may do a little bit less.
Are you guys doing this internally? Have you built up a team who sits and does that, or are you using, how does it look like on the organizational level?
Yes, we have a team, an AML team, which performs the due diligence. We rely quite heavily on technology as well. So using databases which enable you to gather information on clients, on directors and beneficial owners, and even where you're acting for private individuals, rather than, as in years past, you would obtain passports and utility bills, now undertaking that through an ID verification system, which is much better, much more efficient, and more client-friendly as well.
Definitely. Yeah. What's the thing that annoys you the most about that process, like client due diligence? Like, you look at it and it's like, oh man, we still have to do this. So annoying.
I think, it's because we're a global firm and you're acting for clients across the world. In certain jurisdictions, it's easier to perform due diligence just because of the laws in that place, and the culture just mean that information is more accessible. You can go to company's house or you can go to the relevant company registry and extract the information quite easily. In other locations, they don't have the same systems, and because of that, even the databases that you rely on from time to time can't give you the information that you need. So that requires you to interact with the client, to ask for information, to go back to the more manual route, and that can take time. Obviously, you don't want to trouble the client. You want to make the onboarding process as smooth as possible. But because of those, deficiencies or differences in how particular jurisdictions address company registry of information, those challenges do come up, and it can be frustrating. It takes more time, more resource, and you would just prefer a smoother process in the ideal world.
In the ideal world, I agree. So what is the top priorities that you have, like top 3 priorities going forward for Orrick in the AML compliance space?
Me personally, I'm always focused on continuing improvement. Personally, always wanting to develop and improve, but also for the firm as well, and the areas that I manage to improve how things are done. And as a result, I'm part of a number of external groups with my peers, trying to learn from them, pick their brains, see what's impacting them, And you often learn that you're all suffering from the same problems.
Yes.
And then you can learn from each other, understand what technologies they are using or suggest technologies. And for me, one priority is just improving our processes, enhancing them, seeing what technologies can support us, can make things easier, can provide better quality of data for our partners as they want to understand who their clients are. So that's one priority. I guess the second priority for me is just that continual awareness for our teams. As a compliance person, sometimes you can get stuck running the checks and not having the context, knowing how things have changed, because the money laundering risks don't always remain the same.
No, it can change quite fast.
They do. So it's important to remain up to date, to see what the trends are in order to inform the firm and to protect the firm and our partners from those risks which do exist. So that's the second item. Third priority, I guess, is working with Strise, the early access program.
Okay.
I think.
I'm glad to hear.
For me, it's actually quite important, because I think when you're looking at technologies, you don't just want to obtain something and bolt it on to something that you already have. For example, in a global firm, you utilize a range of resources. You may have 4 or 5 databases on the go just to perform due diligence on one single client. And that's how things are. But, I like what Strise are wanting to do, to understand the problems impacting firms, working together to see how we can address those issues. And if it's possible, I guess my zenith, as it were, is for there to be one tool to rule them all. If I could...
That's what everyone in compliance says. Like, everyone's like, I have so many tools.
I know.
Why can't we just have that magic wand and just be, magic wand and just one tool?
I know.
But it's still very fragmented, the processes, and yeah.
It is.
We're working on it.
No, I'm looking forward to working
But
with
you mentioned in the beginning, like priority 1, peer groups and knowledge sharing, and it's very interesting, to hear that you're doing it, because one of the things in my experience in this AML compliance industry is that there's so little incentive to share publicly, like, hey, we are struggling with this, can someone help us? Whereas in the tech world, it's so many times you hear someone, hey, we are struggling with this problem, this is not working, we tried this, can someone help us? But in the compliance space, it's like, if you shared everything, hey, we don't have our sanctions program up to date, we're really struggling implementing this, like the regulators would come knocking on your door the next day. So, but sharing will improve the situation for everyone, but it's such a weird dynamic, I find. I don't know if that's why you have the more closed peer groups, I assumed.
Yeah, I think it's important to share information, particularly amongst peers. I don't feel there should be competition in that sense where, you're kind of pointing fingers. We're all...
Because it's like working towards the greater good, like
Exactly.
fighting financial crime. But do you feel the same, that there's no real incentive to kind of share publicly what is not working because the risk is so big?
I guess that's true. You don't want to put your hand up and say, my sanctions process is almost non-existent, because, that would not be good for the firm if anyone did find out. So I understand it from that perspective. But at the same time, I think the only way to improve is to learn from others.
True.
And I think you do need to be open about, maybe what the challenges are. And each firm is different. Each firm has its own risk profile. They have their own resources, or so what you learn from one and the struggles of one, it may be particular to yourself, so perhaps you don't need to disclose everything, but just generally understanding where the industry is moving, how things are improving, how other teams work, the sizes of their teams, the programs they use. I don't know, I find that so valuable, and it just helps you to understand where things are moving and to support the firm and to, address the risks in the right way.
Yeah. There's one topic that I want to touch upon before we end the conversation as well, and that is about getting back to the topic of how fast things change in like anti-money laundering, and how and that space is the war in Ukraine, obviously, and now we're at the 11th sanction package in a year and a half, so things are changing really, really fast. And did the invasion of Ukraine act as a wake-up call for many legal firms, you think?
I think it did. I think one thing it highlighted was that it's so important to have good quality data and records identifying your clients and their beneficiaries and directors, so that if there are these geopolitical changes and sanctions, for example, that you can quickly go back, look at your data, knowing that it's current, and can determine whether you're exposed on the sanction side and things of that nature. And for me, when that event happened, then you begin thinking about, okay, well, how can we ensure that our checks are updated routinely?
Yeah.
And you want something which automates your monitoring, that provides you with alerts, rather than in the past having a team member designated with going through your entire client list and running manual searches. And that's very onerous. It's not the best way to do things, and there is technology now available to assist with that. But certainly, and I think firms which have an AML program probably fared better than others that didn't. For example, in certain locations, they don't have the same level of AML rules that we do in Europe or in the UK. So they didn't have information on beneficial owners and directors to hand, and then it became more difficult to look back at their client list and see where the risks are, to see where they're exposed. So I think it did act as a wake-up call. And now firms that I know of are interested in perfecting their data and looking at programs which can assist them to maintain this ongoing monitoring obligation. And I think that's probably one of the trickier aspects of the due diligence that you do on clients. The onboarding is one thing, but it's the ongoing monitoring, having that information updated and current, and then that information becomes valuable, because if it just remains static once you've done it, then that doesn't really help you address the risk.
And also, if someone's they can just change it after being onboarded,
Precisely.
as a strategy too. So yeah, it's important with the perpetual KYC. But just on the legal side, there was a report. I'm just going to find the numbers here. So it was a report from the UK government. It was that Russia was highly dependent on Western countries for legal services, and 85% of all legal services were being imported from G7 countries, and UK accounted for 59% of these imports. I gotta ask you, you must have heard some horror stories that you can share, maybe anonymously. Are there anyone you heard about the legal sector in the UK that suddenly had a lot of oligarchs that were sanctioned in their portfolio, and what happened?
Did I hear? Well, I guess, as you say, I think, firms have historically worked closely with Russian clients, and, it was fine at that time. Obviously, the sanctions changed the landscape, and I think certain firms then had to take a position, which for some can be quite difficult, because the sanctions doesn't, write off the entire nation, and you had to be careful. And I know certain firms released information saying, look, we comply with all obligations under law, sanctions, and so on. But, also we don't want to discriminate against an entire nation because of the issues that are happening there. So I did hear some stories, but those are mainly read. And yeah, that's probably as much as I can say.
All right. But so if, let's say you guys get a sanctions hit in your client portfolio, what would be the process then? From a legal perspective, what would a law firm need to do then?
Well, I guess depending on the sanctions hit, you would obviously need to report that to senior management within the firm, whether that be the compliance officer for the legal practice or the MLRO or whoever it may be. And then depending on the nature of the hit, you would probably work to extricating yourself from that relationship. If you're prevented from providing ongoing legal advice or services, that can make things difficult, and you would have to try and address that as best as possible.
This brings me to an interesting topic, which is the culture of compliance. Because I can imagine that, you know, back in the day before the AML legislation hit the legal sector, it was more about, you know, let's get clients, let's bill the hours. And now suddenly there is this whole friction in the customer onboarding journey. And some lawyers might not like that as much and might not think, it's a checkbox exercise. Is it really this important? First of all, have you guys been able to kind of foster a culture of compliance at Orrick? And how did you go about doing it and making sure that everyone kind of understands the severity of this and how important it is?
It's a collective effort, I would say, at Orrick. We have a great team, starting from the General Counsel's office and to the local subject matter experts in particular locations as well. But we provide a lot of training. Our GC and the deputies are always looking at ways to communicate information in innovative ways, to share war stories, for example, learning from the failures perhaps of other firms or mistakes that others have made in order to inform our people of how best to operate within this dynamic regulatory environment. But I think developing a culture of compliance is so important. As you say, if it then becomes a tick box exercise, it can be quite difficult. You can miss issues.
Miss a lot of stuff.
And just expose the firm to risk. So that continual awareness, sharing of information, and ensuring that our people are trained and in tune with our policies and procedures is so key. And I think part of that is having a compliance team who are almost separate from the partners, because our role, my role, is to look after the firm. That's what I also think about the commercial aspect of the firm, of them doing well, being able to do work. So I don't try to stop work from happening, but I look for issues which could affect the firm. And if there are issues, it's about having a conversation. If you do, for example, screen the client, you may find some adverse media. It's about, okay, well, how do we address that? How do we overcome that? What risk does this present to the firm? And having that discussion with the partners, with senior members of the firm, and addressing that together. And we do that very well at Orrick, and I'm sure many other firms would say they do the same also. Continual awareness, and also testing your systems. I think that's very important. The regulations require you to, set up an independent audit function, which can be very difficult within firms to have that. So you may hire externally, and Orrick have done the same. And it's a very good learning tool to learn about your processes and systems, and to see, and for someone to come in from the outside and say, look, you're doing well, but from our experience, this could be done better, or you could do this. Have you considered that? And I think that's so invaluable as well. So testing your systems and raising awareness amongst your people, I think, really helps to develop that culture of compliance and communicate why it's important. And and I guess when you do have those war stories, knowing that I don't want those things to happen to me is usually a good motivator.
For sure. So just to close out the conversation, why do you think it's so important? Like, with your words, why is it so important to get anti-money laundering and compliance right? Because some people might hear, compliance, and think, that's so boring. But why is this important?
Well, I think it's important because of the impact of getting things wrong. If you get things wrong, the problems can be quite significant for the firm, for you personally, and also for the industry. And, as I said at the beginning, lawyers, they have an obligation to ensure that trust in the profession is maintained at the highest standard. And where you do see those failures, it just doesn't affect one firm, it affects all. So the Panama Papers and things of that nature, where law firms were deemed professional enablers of these activities, doesn't look well upon anyone within the legal industry. So us being able to maintain our obligations at the highest standard helps us personally, but it helps the entire industry. And And obviously it keeps the bad guys away. So I think it's very important, the risk of getting things wrong. But also our clients, and that's the most important thing. They want to ensure that the lawyers that are representing them are upholding the laws and regulations, that they will not incur any reputational damage by being associated with us. So it goes hand in hand with the business, ensuring that we're doing everything properly. Will only be better for us operating as a business within this industry.
That brings the spin of the laundry to an end. Bruno, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find out more about you and connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn, so if anyone wants to connect with me, please look up Bruno Edenogie at Orrick, and you'll find me, and I'll happily accept your invite. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this episode, don't forget to check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And please also leave a review if you think this was good. To get in touch with the Laundry team, you can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew Dunne-Miles. Our engineers were Niklas Thon and George Stzuka. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, an AML intelligence platform. To find out more about Strise, go to strise.ai. See you next time.